Episode 20 begins in Harvey's office. So, inside Harvey's office were a bunch of clients, and one of them just asked Harvey to get China on the phone until his daughter shows up. Anyway, Harvey demands to know from his daughter what kind of favor she wants from him. Well, she explains, I have some business matters to discuss with you. Well, before he could get underway, that's when Possess decided to let in Eric. You do remember Eric, do you? Possess asks. As a matter of fact, I do, Harvey says, because he remembered that just last season, he's the one that ruined the World Studio. So Eric explains to Harvey, saying, listen, I know we had our differences before, but I got some good news. So what was the good news that Eric wants to discuss with Harvey? He said, listen, I'm into a record business, the only business I know. At first, Harvey wasn't interested. So Eric was telling Harvey that, listen, oil does come from vinyl, right? That's where records come from, right? Then Eric says, wait, there's more. Because if we can pull this off by buying an island off the coast of Alaska, and if we can do it and build a factory on top of it, we can make more records a lot cheaper than what we do. So then it's Pizzazz's turn to make her case for her father to say, think about it, this is the best opportunity yet. There's no way you can pass this up. So how about it? Harvey's daughter asked. What's your decision? So Harvey says, okay, I'll tell you what I can do. I'll meet you in Alaska about a week. And if everything checks out fine, I'll pick up the paperwork by then. But Harvey says, wait, there is one condition. If Pizzazz goes along with you to make sure that everything goes well and to make sure you do the job right. So Pizzazz agrees to go with Eric to Alaska. And then Harvey says, oh, one more thing. Do me a favor. Please make me proud. Don't ever disappoint me again, okay? So both Eric and Pizzazz left Harvey's office. Meanwhile, at Starlight Mansion, it was in the upstairs bedroom that Bonnie of the Starlight Girls just showed Shayna of the holograms a picture of her pen pal that lives there. Her name is Atu Kenyak, and she has a pet seal. As you may have guessed it, Bonnie just received a letter from her pen pal Atu in Alaska, and she sounded distressed and upset. Now, according to Bonnie, here comes a serious problem because she said that someone just recently bought an island in Alaska and she has no idea what to make of it or why. But what Bonnie and Shayna didn't know that overhearing the conversation while entering the bedroom were Jerica and Rhea. And if that's not bad enough, Bonnie just told Shayna if something isn't done about it soon, Nakun and his seal pals will lose the island if the factory is built on top of it, and worst of all, they'll die. When Jerica shows up minutes later and she says, oh my goodness, this is serious. So after Jerica looks at the picture of Atu Kenyak, who's Bonnie of the Starlight Girls' pen pal, she asked a question. But first of all, she said that there's some good news. That since Jim is supposed to be performing there and along with her bandmates, Jerica wants to know if Bonnie can tag along with them to Alaska. That made Bonnie happy, and she was more than happy to do that. So she hugs Jerica. So meanwhile, the Misfits and Eric had just arrived in Alaska, but as you can tell by now that Pizzazz is not exactly happy with the way that she and her bandmates were traveling by dog sleds. However, Eric just said, I'm sorry, but there are no planes that could take us to that island that we were supposed to build a factory on. Well, your plan better be right once my father arrives, Pizzazz said. But little didn't Pizzazz, her misfits, and of course Eric knew that there's a plane flying overhead above them. Speaking of an airplane, the guy that is piloting the airplane is Mr. Saunders, and inside were Jim, the holograms, Bonnie of the Starlight Girls, and her pen pal, Atu Kenyak. So Mr. Sanders was more than happy to show the holograms and of course Bonnie the sights of Alaska. So speaking of which, we go to the song called Land of the Midnight Sun by the holograms while the plane is flying around. Then we get to see some seals swimming in the water. Of course, Land of the Midnight Sun is what Alaska is known for. So when the song came to an end, the plane landed right in front of Kenyak Lodge. That's where Atu lives. And there, the holograms met up with Atu's father and, of course, her brother, George. Of course, Atu's mother is with Atu's father. I forgot to mention that. So anyway, that's when the holograms suddenly discovered that they're not the only ones in Alaska because guess who decided to show up? None other than Eric himself. He and the Misfits were also there. You can tell that Eric is surprised to see Jim and the holograms who were also there. So George just told Eric the good news. I think my father had decided to sell you the island. However, Otto demanded to know from her brother what's going to happen to the seals. So George relayed that question by asking his sister, so what about it? So George told her sister, think about it. We're going to make so much money that I'm not going to be in the middle of nowhere for a long time. Really? Otto asked. So you're willing to kill in order to be rich? So George and Otto's father says, I'm sorry, Mr. Raymond, but I'm afraid we'll have to talk about it tomorrow. So finally, Eric agrees with Mr. Kenyak and says, okay, I'll be back by then. So after that, everyone left and inside the Kenyak Lodge. So later, inside Kenyak Lodge, there's Bonnie washing dishes with Otu, her pen pal. Now, Bonnie tries to cheer up her pen pal the best way she knew how and says, don't worry, I'm sure everything will turn out okay. Now, Rhea of the holograms, who overheard what Bonnie told her pen pal, she says, of course they will, because she happens to agree with Bonnie. So Rhea made a suggestion for Atu and Bonnie to go visit Naku, but Atu doesn't want to because she has been lately been depressed. On top of that, there's a lot of chores for Atu to do. So then it's Shayna's turn to make a suggestion. Why don't you two have fun and we'll take care of the chores for you? So both Atu and Bonnie agreed to go outside, but under one condition, if Jim can go along with them. So Jim agrees. So when Jim, along with the girls, go outside to where the canoes were parked at, that's when Atu suggested that they should go to Atuk Island, but there's a problem. They had to take the long way around, where the current was safe. Now, Atuk Island, according to what Atu said, is where her pet seal and his pals live. At first, Bonnie was going to climb into the canoe, but Jim wouldn't allow it. Why not? Atu's doing it by herself, Bonnie explains. However, Jim says that first of all, it's much too dangerous for Bonnie to be by herself, and second of all, that it is true that Atu knows how to take care of herself. So now the two kayaks are off to Atuk Island. So meanwhile, at the landing strip, after Eric came back from Kenyak Lodge, he told his bandmates the bad news. He said that Mr. Kenyak won't be able to sign the contract until the next day. He explains to his bandmates also that Mr. Kenyak and George would be easy to convince, but it's George's sister that is a tough nut to crack. Then Eric and his misfits just heard Harvey Gabor over the radio. So Harvey over the radio was asking Eric, do you have everything ready for me? Is there a problem? However, Eric hesitated, so then it's Pizzazz' turn to tell her father, well, what Eric means is that we have a tiny little problem. Mr. Kenyak won't be able to sign the contract until morning. So her father finally agrees and says, okay, I'll be back to pick them up by then. And please, Phyllis, do me and yourself a favor. Don't ever disappoint me like this again. And then after that, the transmission ended. So after the transmission came to an end, that's when Pizzazz made the threat clear to Eric to say, I will possibly kill you if you don't get this job right. Meanwhile, back at Kenyak Lodge, the girls were busy chopping up wood outside. Asha, Shayna, Kimber, and Rhea, and sitting against a tree was George, who's Atu's brother. Of course, that's a lot of wood for the Kenyaks, but there's nothing that the holograms couldn't handle, and so after that, George heads off. So back with Bonnie, her pen pal, Atu, and Jim, they made it to Atuk Island, where Atu's pet seal and his friends live. Now you can tell that the girls, Jim, Atu, and Bonnie, can see the marvelous view of the seals, including Natu's pet seal from up above, the rocks that is. Back at Kenyak Lodge, George just made a compliment with the girls. You girls did very well. Well, thank you very much, Asha said. However, George just accidentally let slip to Asha to say, I just can't wait till the next day. Well, what happens then? Asha asked. Then George says, well, I'm going to be rich tomorrow, and I don't have to work anymore. Now, Rhea can tell that there's something off with George. So Kimber was asking him, what about the seals that live on Tug Island? What do you mean what's going to happen to them? George asked. Think about it, George says. What has these seals ever done for us? And you want to know what else? George says. You sound just like my sister. Then George told the girls, you want to know something else? With this money I'm going to earn, she's going to earn some of it too so she can go to college. So then it's Rhea's turn to ask a question. Can't you find some other way to put the factory on top of the island without hurting the seals themselves? Then George just insulted her by asking this question. Why don't you just mind your own business? And then he heads off. So meanwhile, back on Tuck Island with Jim, Bonnie of the Starlight Girls, and Utu. And guess what? They just found Utu's pet seal that's coming in their direction, and he was glad to see Utu. So after the reunion between Utu and Noku, Jim had a suggestion for her to say, maybe we should have your brother out here. Then maybe, just maybe, he just may change his mind. But Utu soon dismisses her and said that there's no way. She's already tried that several times, and there's no way he could be convinced otherwise. So in other words, what she's telling Jim is that she had failed miserably. And when Jim looks behind her, she soon realizes that Bonnie is trying to kayak all by herself. So Jim was asking Bonnie, have you lost your mind? What are you doing? I'm trying to be the better kayaker as two was, Bonnie says. Come back here, Jim said, but Bonnie soon ignores her. So when Bonnie tries to attempt to paddle her way back, she suddenly got caught into a whirlpool. So it's now up to Jim and Atu to save her, and good thing they did so. Atu and Jim tries to hurry to save Bonnie the best way they knew how, and luckily they reached her, only to find out that Jim has slipped and hit her head. But she'll be all right. Anyway, things looked hopeless for the girls. That was until Naku and his seal pals came to rescue them when they did. And good news, they were brought to shore, thanks to Naku and his seal friends. But the bad news is that Bonnie just lost her hat while she was in the water. Back with the Misfits, however, in their snowmobiles, you can tell that they're getting extremely bored. And since there is no way of waiting for Eric any longer, so what did they do? Do what they know best, making some mischief. And speaking of making mischief, that was the name of the Misfits song that was sung last season. And what they did was, while snowmobiling all over town, they caused one of the cars to collide into a brick wall. The next thing that the Misfits did with their snowmobiles was just drive right through the mud and got mud all over the laundry that was hung out to dry. The last thing that the Misfits did was to drive their snowmobiles right through the biggest fish net that they have ever seen. So the song came to an end with the dog sled driver being knocked over by a bunch of snowmobiles. So back with Bonnie, Jim, and Utu, and also Utu and his seal pals, good news for them, they made it to the deserted island up ahead. Back with the Misfits, Possess just looks at Bonnie, Jim, who is knocked out at the moment, and Utu making it to shore through her binoculars. So Stormer made a suggestion. Maybe we should go help them or something. After Pizzazz thought of Stormer's suggestion and says, well, I got an idea that's even better. So Pizzazz suggested that the Misfits should rescue Atu, Jim, and of course Bonnie, the Starlight Girls. However, Roxy doesn't agree with it, but then asks the question, are you crazy? In fact, the other mischief that agrees with Pizzazz was actually Jetta. So Pizzazz said to Misfits, listen, here's what we'll do. If we can rescue Atu for ourselves and return her to the Konyaks, then maybe Mr. Kenya can sign that contract in no time. Even though Roxy wasn't sure of it, but Jazz says, good idea. And so all the Misfits head off. Back at Kenyak Lodge, George and his father were busy mending the fishing net, and they're getting extremely worried, and they couldn't help but wonder why hasn't Atu hasn't showed up yet. In the meantime, when the holograms came back, they got some good news. All the chores were done. The first thing that George did was to thank the holograms for all the chores that Atu had. Next thing he did was to apologize for his past behavior earlier on. Then George made an omission with the holograms to say, this money is very important for not just for myself, but also my family. The holograms not only accepted George's apology, but couldn't help but wonder what's keeping Jim and what's going on with Bonnie and her pal and why they hadn't come back yet. Mr. Kenyak, who agrees with the holograms, he too is getting increasingly worried and concerned. So back with the three girls who are stranded on the island thanks to Naku and his seal pals that brought them there earlier, unfortunately Jim's still knocked unconscious at the moment. Bonnie tries to wake her up but no such luck, so she's asking her pen pal, what are we gonna do? Then Bonnie says that here's a bigger problem. Nobody knows where we are. Atu, being supportive as she is, tells Bonnie not to panic. Luckily for her, she carries a box of matches just in case. So Atu suggested to build a fire around them to keep them warm. Not a bad idea. Back with the Misfits, Pizzazz has suggested Jetta to go with her on a boat so they can reach Atu, Jim, and Bonnie. At first, Roxy just throws that insult at Jetta to say, what's the matter? Are you not royalty enough to ride a boat? So after Jetta exchanged that insult back at Roxy, she goes along with Pizzazz, and so both of the women head off, so that leaves Roxy and Stormer to stay behind. Back at Kenyak Lodge, both George and Mr. Kenyak are really concerned and worried. They had to find these girls, but they knew they had to hurry because Mr. Kenyak said that by the time the fog rolls in, and if those girls ain't found very quick, it could mean a disaster, a serious problem. So George suggested that he'll contact Mr. Sanders, the pilot, to go find them right away. Back with Jim, Bonnie, and Otto on an island, Bonnie unfortunately still couldn't wake up Jim, and as for Otto, she's now left to wonder where did her pet seal go and why did he have to wander off. The worst of it all, it was getting cold on the island, and it's too bad too because Bonnie had lost her hat when she fell in the water. So meanwhile, at the docks, the holograms met up with Mr. Sanders, the pilot, and along with George and Mr. Kenyak. So Mr. Kenyak says, listen, we don't have much time. These girls must be found. And they knew they had to hurry. So Mr. Kenyak suggested that they should cover more ground if they split up. So they did. Back with Pizzazz and Jetta of the Misfits who were in a motorboat in the middle of the ocean, that's when they were caught in the current out of nowhere and they were about to collide into those rocks. If that's not bad enough, the motorboat's motor stopped working and the girls panicked. Things looked bad for the Misfits when they were about to collide into the icebergs up ahead, but luckily for the boat, it has a couple of paddles, so they had no choice but to paddle their way through. Well, good news for Jetta and Pizzazz, they managed to avoid the collision with the icebergs. Back to the island with Jim, Bonnie, and of course, Atu. Well, good news, Atu manages to build a fire, and that's when Jim woke up. After Jim woke up, she wanted to know what was going on. Well, Atu was more than happy to explain because thanks to her pet seal and his pals, they made it to shore. Now it's Bonnie's turn to tell Jim the bad news because Atu's pet seal and his pals wandered off somewhere and has no idea on what to do next. Well, Jim says the first thing we're going to do is not panic and then complimented to Atu for a job well done on building a fire. It's at least she could do, case in point. Although Atu appreciated Jim's compliment and said all we have to do now is just wait and hope for someone to come rescue us. Meanwhile, Mr. Kenyak and his boat, and along with his son George and most of the holograms, they just received the bad news. They just found a canoe all wrecked to pieces. After the Kenyaks and the holograms received the bad news, George asked his father a question. What now? To answer George's question, that's when Asha and Rhea, who were with the Kenyaks, Asha goes first to speak in her case to say, we can't give up yet. We had to keep looking. In the meantime, Mr. Saunders, who was with the airplane, and with him were Kimber and Shayna. And guess who Mr. Saunders found? Jetta and Possess stranded in the middle of the sea, avoiding collision with icebergs everywhere. So Sheena and Kimber, after they found out, asked Mr. Saunders to go and pick them up. and that's what he did. So, back on the boat with Rhea and Asha the holograms and along with the Kenyaks. George, however, who was driving the boat, felt absolutely guilt-ridden about his fight that he had with his sister and wished he'd never done it, and hopes and prays that she makes it safe. But then suddenly he spotted Naku and his seal pals out of nowhere, and guess what they had? They had Bonnie's hat. And they're guiding the boat to the island to where the three women are being stranded. The three women being Bonnie, Otu, her pen pal, and Jim. George and Mr. Kenyak were very stunned. They just couldn't believe it. So finally, good news for Jim, Atu, and Bonnie, they were being rescued by Mr. Kenyak and, of course, Atu's brother, George. Not only are George, who's Atu's brother, and Mr. Kenyak were happy to see that Atu is safe, but two of the holograms, Asha and, of course, Rhea, are happy to see that Jim's been safe too. So, Atu deserves most of the credit, and so is her pet seal, because he's the one that saved the day. So everybody got off the island, and just in time back to Kenyak Lodge. But what the Kenyans didn't know is that they're not the only ones who are back. Eric came back too. Now, with a contract in his hand, he said to Mr. Kenyak, "Well, thank you for meeting me here. I got all the papers all signed up. That is, if you're ready to sign up too." However, George goes first to ask a question. Aren't you aware that the Atak Island where the seals come from is where we left from? And if Eric, according to what George is asking in his case, if Eric was ever aware of it. So what the Kings was asking about is if the cove can be stayed for the seals. So Eric asks, "Are you kidding me?" So Eric tries to claim a case to the Kings that the cove will be used for boats and stuff once the factory's been built. Now Mr. Kayak realizes that something must be off. So George, who's a two sister, decides to drop a bombshell on Eric to say, "I'm sorry, but that island's not for sale." Then minutes later, the Misfits show up. Now, don't ask me how they arrived. I guess they arrived with Mr. Sanders, the pilot. I can't say for sure. So Pizzazz goes first to speak in her case to ask a question. "Why not? You must sail the island." "I'm sorry," Mr. Kenya said when it's his turn to speak in his case to say, "We're just not interested." "Then what else do you need?" Eric said when he asked the question. "Do you need more money?" "Well," George explains, "there are a lot of important things that are a lot better than that." Then suddenly the mistress just heard Pizzazz's father's plane up above. Now poor Pizzazz panicked because she's left to wonder how she's going to explain this to her father. So when her father over the radio was asking Phyllis the exact same question that he asked Eric, "Do you have everything ready for me? Is everything okay?" So Pizzazz, now ashamed with regret, saying, "No, Daddy, I'm afraid there's bad news. Everything's not ready." And then Harvey says, "And to think you're gonna make me happy. But obviously I was wrong. I'll see you in a couple of days." Before the transmission ended, Pizzazz panicked and says, "Wait, you can't just leave me here." And unfortunately for Harvey, he's going to have a serious chatting with Possess when she gets back. So after that, the transmission ended. Meanwhile, at the Alaskan airport, Rio shows up minutes later to join up with Jim and her bandmates and the Kenyaks as well. So after Rio arrived to meet up with Jim and her bandmates and the Kenyaks was asking Jim and her bandmates if they could do a favor for her to write a song. Well, Jim was more than happy to do it with the song Safe and Sound by the Holograms. So you know what this means. It was thanks to Naku who saved their lives, the holograms that is, and to help Atu reunite with her family, no longer will Nutuk Island be threatened. So, in other words, Atu deserves most the credit. So, after the song came to an end, it's now time for Jim, the holograms, and Rio to leave. So, before they can do so, Jim was asking Bonnie if she was sure she's going to be okay. So, you know what this means. Jim has allowed Bonnie and the Starlight Girls to stay with the Kayaks for another week. If, under one condition, if Bonnie promises never to go kayaking alone again. And she agrees to do that. Bonnie, that is. So finally, the holograms had left Alaska, and along with Rio. But they're not the only ones because back with the Misfits, it was their time to leave Alaska too. And Pizzazz, however, has had enough of Eric's failures. And Pizzazz just told Eric, you know what? This deal's falling through thanks to you. You know, my father has told me to keep an eye on you, but I don't have to listen to him any longer. So you know what this means? She and the rest of the Misfits decided to leave Eric all by himself in Alaska. So that ends episode 20.